Hi, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about globalization, what it was, what it was intended to do, how it played out, and what's happening with it right now. The dynamics of globalization are threefold. It's about trade, it's about security, and there's a cultural element to it as well. Pre-globalization, thinking about the period from 1600 to 1945, mostly economic systems functioned on protectionist policies, mercantilism, which is we want to export everything that we possibly can. We want to make everything here, and it doesn't matter what it costs. We're going to overwhelm our countries around us, which we're seen as adversaries. Just crank out as much stuff as we possibly can, and that's how we're going to make money. The other aspect of pre-globalization is colonialism. That embodied the most powerful countries going around the world, finding poor countries, taking them over, and then extracting as much resources as they could from them. Now, that colonial system and mercantilism really kind of started to fall apart because there were a lot of wars. I know that we look around our world and see a lot of conflicts, but boy, let me tell you what, count them up from 1600 to say 1939 and don't even include World War II, and you've got a really, really large number. If you divide it out and average it by decades or by centuries, it far outpaces what we have experienced during our lifetimes for sure. So what is globalization? I talked about trade, security, and cultural elements as dynamics within the overall idea of globalization. We're talking about free trade, trade that can flow between just about any country or combination of countries in the world. We're talking about security, meaning military alliances designed to protect and enhance trade routes. Culturally speaking, and this has something to do with economics also, is the free movement of ideas, the free movement of people to a degree so that countries can acquire labor, paying them to come to do things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get done. Pre-globalization, you had a situation where most countries were protectionist, meaning that they had very high tariff rates. They didn't want anybody sending things to them. They wanted to make everything themselves and then export it. The most powerful countries like Great Britain and France and Germany and Russia and so forth and so on, were constantly building more industry and cranking stuff out and growing things and sending them out to overwhelm the markets of smaller countries or less powerful ones. There's also a strong colonial element to pre-globalization in that big, strong countries go to smaller countries that can't resist them, take them over, and extract their resources. France was particularly bad about this, but so was the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, go on and on and on. Why did globalization even occur? Well, first off, you have the First World War, which was in some sense caused by economic factors, led many of these countries to be on the verge of bankruptcy as a result of their really terrible economic practices wrought by quasi-governmental royal family interference in many cases, where you just had people who had no idea what they were doing, setting up these deals and getting things done. So you had World War I, which led to a tremendous amount of destruction and damage in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Some of the countries that were damaged severely, of course, were Germany, which had previously been an industrial powerhouse. Russia suffered greatly. The United Kingdom suffered greatly. Basically, the end of British colonialism really got a kick in the pants right there because of World War I. Now, when you consider that the post-war interim period between 1918 and 1939, when the Second World War started off with some really draconian economic consequences for Germany, who prior to this, if you fought a war, it wasn't necessarily going to be, well, let's just destroy their economy, which is exactly what the victors of World War I did, setting up a situation in which it was rather easy for Hitler to come in and establish himself as a viable alternative to democracy in Germany. Furthermore, the Russian Revolution had happened, and Russia was destitute after World War I and was trying to head this revolution off. And they couldn't borrow money from anybody to do it because none of the other countries would loan them anything. They didn't have anything to loan. Then we have World War II as a result of that. Again, immensely costly economically, in terms of lives, in terms of every aspect of society was touched and damaged by World War II, really globally. This led a number of countries and leadership figures to consider, how can we avoid this sort of thing from ever happening again? The first sort of framework of globalization was an agreement called Bretton Woods, which was made actually, I think, in 1944. It started the ball rolling for systems of international organizations which would have government participation that had a lot to do with international development. Things like the World Bank were discussed, things like the International Monetary Fund, the UN, of course, and establishing some sort of system for global trade. Now, who wrote these rules? The United States, because we were the most powerful one around at that time. These things developed with that in mind. To the victor goes the spoils, but at the same time, this is a system of international rules, norms, and structures that allow finance to flow places that it never had before. So yes, we want to be able to come into your markets, and we want to sell things to you, and we want to build things, and we want some measure of influence. We're not going to run your country, but we also expect that you will be open to the ideas that we have about how you can build things there that you can export to the rest of the world. And a lot of systems come into play in that way that allow a lot of people to come out of destitute poverty, to rebuild Europe in the wake of World War II, to bring education, communication, travel, all sorts of things to stretches and areas of the world that never would have had it. Plus, things like the World Health Organization. That is a facet of globalization. A whole range of health things, public health things, disaster relief, on and on and on. On some, if you can't tell, not a bad deal for everyone involved. Yes, controlled largely by the United States and other large financial powers, but did it help a lot of people? Yes, it did. Really, peak globalization started to slide back from about 2010 on. We are definitely on the road out of it at this point, and especially since Trump was elected. Another facet that, again, people are going to be like, oh my God, why is he talking great about these things? But multinational corporations are a facet of globalization. The ability to have offshore bank accounts that are legal and things like in the 2008 financial crisis, the ability to rely on world financial systems to stabilize your countries in the event of crises and depression-like things. We haven't had a global depression since 1929. Not too shabby. There had been several in the centuries before that. Also, that idea of the free movement of people. As long as you don't live in an authoritarian country, you can kind of go where you want, reestablish yourself somewhere new. All of these things led to a period of relative international peace. Again, not perfect, but a relative international peace. No giant major power wars since 1945. I also meant to add that for the security side of things, the U.S. Navy was tasked with securing those sea lanes, which is particularly important in the South Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Also, we established NATO and encouraged the countries that were going to participate in these new trade relationships to be anti-communist. The economic theory that sort of explains this is called Heckscher-Ohlin theory. In all of the places where something can be made properly at a lower cost, that's where we're going to make that. And then we will take those pieces and bring them together in different places around the world until we reach the final market for that product. A core example of that would be automobiles, but airplanes fit the bill, all kinds of high-tech stuff. Globalization created the environment in which supply chains can exist. If you don't secure your sea lanes to allow for trade to flow unimpeded, you can't have globalization. The United States has been backing away from this role as the security for these global trade routes for a bit. Certainly during the first Trump administration, the United States and its leaders have decided that they really don't want to pay for that. Perhaps they're right in part, but to step away from that responsibility altogether seems to me to be very, very short-sighted, especially given that a new system with any sort of stability is not in place at this time. So as globalization recedes, what should we expect to see? Well, if you live in a small country or especially an island country, you might be wanting to move as soon as you can because those sorts of places are going to get cut off. If they can't sustain themselves on their own go, they're going to have a lot of trouble keeping the lights on, let alone feeding people. A lot of other places around the world are going to fall into chaos. There's going to be a lot of regression back to a period more akin to the late 1800s, early 1900s, in my opinion. And I think that we're going to see a lot less democracy and a lot more conflict. That's not great. Realists would almost certainly agree with me. They might even kind of be looking forward to that. It makes things simpler for them. What that means for people living in the United States or other large industrialized countries is that a lot of manufacturing that takes place in a lot of different other places is either going to have to move close to home or move back home altogether. And that's going to be disruptive as well as very expensive. I hope this explains a bit about what globalization is and how it works and where we're going next. Hope I'm wrong, but I'm pretty solid on this reasoning in my opinion. If you have other opinions or thoughts, I certainly welcome them in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks a lot.